economic relations are pervasive to society. They happen all the time. From the moment you wake up, everything that you do in your household, you at some point had to pay something for it. So you had to choose which products to buy and in which markets, and then you still have subscriptions, and you have a job, and that job is part of a job market, and so on and so forth. The idea that something is a slippery slope, and if you start talking about redistribution, you end up with communism, is the weakest possible intellectual argument. The idea that once you open the Pandora box, there is no way to know what's coming out of there. It's lazy. It's absolutely lazy, right? It presupposes that people are not capable of finding an intermediate point between two extremes. Pessimistically speaking, we might be heading for a long period of increase inequality, and then throw into that the issue of climate change. So that might be the ultimate break to that system, not because of some internal mechanisms of society, but because nature and the planet itself is going to put a stop to it, and maybe with more pandemics and so on, but that's very bleak and pessimistic. Economics matter because it affects the lives of everybody, right? So it's not just an intellectual exercise. It's something that plays into how you organize work, how you organize relationships between the people who have capital and the people who don't have capital. How do you organize financial interactions, and then as you keep aggregating things more and more, it goes all the way up to how the whole of society interacts with the environment, because it affects production, and it affects how production ultimately feeds back into the planet and the resources that we have. So all the way from individual work relationships, all the way up to the interaction with the planet, it's all related to how economics is done. So it matters quite a lot. Abstract, pure research in economics and policymaking is a lot more blur and diffuse, and it should be, because economics is not an abstract endeavor, as I answered in the first question. It's something that relates to real lives and real relationships and interactions, and ultimately with the physical constraints that we have around us. So it's a little funny for me to say that. I'm a mathematician myself, and mathematics can be defined as an abstract endeavor. Parts of mathematics, which mathematicians like to call pure math, and even there, the distinction between pure math and applied math is not very rigid and should not be. So we can talk about mathematics if you want, but going back strictly to economics is a bit like saying, what is the difference between abstract epidemiology and epidemiology applied to a policymaker? There should not be, right? The entire subject is dedicated to, and I'm using epidemiology because, of course, we are still in the middle of a pandemic, and everybody became an amateur epidemiologist, and there's a resurgence of understanding of even things that people would call very abstract mathematical models for disease contagion and spread. And it turns out that they're not abstract at all. These are the things that actually happen when a virus, a pathogen arises. And you need that kind of modeling, because you cannot just rely on just data and extrapolation of data. As everybody was seeing at the beginning of the pandemic, these were exponential rates, and if you just extrapolated that, you would find that there would be more people infected than people in the planet, and of course it doesn't make sense. So you know that these things are going to turn around and saturate, either by the natural development of the disease or because of policy interventions. But this all has to be understood by models. So what are models? Are models abstract academic research, or are they part of policy making? It doesn't really matter. They are the ways that you understand what's happening around you, and with economics is the same thing. I don't think there is any role for doing some mathematical style theorem proven research in economics if that's not related to ultimately some type of policy making that will have an impact on all of the areas that I mentioned in the answer to the first question. Now, policymaking itself is not the only goal, because that's part, what is policymaking is what the one part of the economic system, namely the government, can do to influence what the other actors and what other parts of the economy are doing. So again, using the analogy with the epidemiology, policymaking is just the lockdown and the vaccination and the mask wearing and so on and so forth. But that's only one part of epidemiology. Epidemiology is about understanding the entire mechanisms, all the way from the biology of the pathogens all the way to the interactions of people and the behavior of people. So similarly with economics, I don't mean to say that every single paper in economics needs to have a policy component, because a lot of the work is in understanding how the rest of the system works. Even without the participation of a policymaker or a government or something. So it's understanding at the very fundamental level how firms are organized and workers participate in firms, and how individual households interact with both market and non-market relationships, and then keep aggregation, keep making it larger and larger, and then eventually see what the entire macroeconomic context is about. And of course, governments are part of that, because they exist as both an important economic sector that buys and sells a lot of things. So it's part of the what all of the other agents, households, banks, firms, etc., they need to take into account in their day-to-day decisions. But they are also there for extraordinary circumstances, right? Where there's a crisis, or where there's some maybe it doesn't need to be after a crisis occurs, but in anticipation of something that is going to go very wrong, then government can try to go beyond its day-to-day role in economic relations and try to do something more. So that's where the attention to what the effects of the policy should be heightened. But I would say it should be there all the time, right? There is no economy without a government. And so it's not fruitful, I think, to think of a very strong distinction between abstract, idealized economies or economic research, and then, well, okay, now we come down from that perfect, rational, abstract system and see what the policy should be. It should be entirely integrated. As I'll re-emphasize, there's no point of doing abstract epidemiology if you're not going to deal with real diseases. Plays a very large role and maybe an oversized role. Now it's clear that economic relations are pervasive to society. They happen all the time. From the moment you wake up, everything that you do in your household, you at some point had to pay something for it. So you had to choose which products to buy and in which markets, and then you still have subscriptions, and you have a job, and that job is part of a job market, and so on and so forth. So there's a very unescapable role of economic relations to our lives. They're there all the time. Now, does that mean that economics as a discipline should similarly be as pervasive? This is what economists would like to say, and that the type of logic that applies or dictates the relationships in things that are strictly economic, exchanges and the marketplace, that should also apply to every other corner of our lives. And that, I think, it's an exaggeration, going beyond the what the natural and expected role of economics as a discipline should be, which is to help understand how economic relations are part of life. But there are other things to life, right? So I just said that you buy things and you have a job and you interact with other agents in markets, but that's not the only purpose of why you wake up in the morning and live your life. So there's the other aspects of life that should not have so much of the economic logic and the economic way of organizing relations. So I think the question was, does it play a positive role? So was that part of the question? And I think it plays a positive role as long as it's supported by other disciplines that also help you understand what's going on in all of these interactions. And so obvious other choices are history. Economics should be very much grounded in history because these decisions and markets and governments and economic interactions and relationships don't occur in a historical vacuum. They're not all the same. They don't repeat. So this is not like physics, where you can set up an experimental control laboratory where all the conditions are the same and you just repeat the experiment many times. That doesn't exist in economics. The experiments, they happen in historical time. And most often they just occur once, and you have to follow the trajectory of the experiments to see what the developments are. So history is important. The whole of social sciences and political sciences, psychology. There's all sorts of insights from psychology that should be taken into account in economics, and are not, because they are in conflict with the more abstract, like we were talking before, the more abstract parts of economics, which when it started to be formalized in the 19th century, was a bit more like an introspective question. How should I behave in face of uncertainty or in face of decisions? So it's decision making, but from the point of view of a highly individualized and introspective decision maker, thinking, in ideal circumstances, how would I operate? So Pareto and others that were investigating these questions, they were like that. It was not how do human beings actually make decisions, which is the domain of psychology. And when those two things clash by research in behavior economics in the 20th century, most economists decided to ignore that and say that no, we're still going to be operating in an as-if situation, as if humans were rational, as if they had full information, as if they didn't have any biases. So there should be a bigger role for this other disciplines that also are as pervasive, if not more pervasive than economics in our daily lives, right? I painted a picture that everything that we do throughout the day is related to economic interactions, but even more so, it has to do with the way that our minds are wired. Even before you do an economic interaction, you have a way of making decisions, a way of evaluating risk and evaluating uncertainty, and that sort of precedes economics. So you need to understand that as well. So I would say the positive role of economics needs to be understood in conjunction with all this similarly important and pervasive disciplines. And if it's not, then it becomes a negative, oversized, rigid, and too insular way. So, sorry, just a bit of a sneeze. Too insular way of trying to understand the phenomenon, which is a very complex phenomenon and should not be understood by economics alone. So I would say no, and it by extension of my previous answer, you shouldn't do it alone, because all those things involve both expertise and domains of human experience that are beyond economics. You mentioned, of course, a large array of different problems, but so just picking in no specific order, it would be preposterous to try to understand race relations from the point of view of economics, because it would be ahistoric, it would be outside the social context in which they happen, and it would even be outside of the psychological way in which race is constructed and understood. So it shouldn't. Having said that, it should complement the insights of all these other disciplines into race relations, because there is an important economic aspect. We know from the study of history of slavery and all sorts of other important determinants of race relations, that they had an economic basis, that they were a way of producing exactly profits and helping consumption and increase in capital and so on and so forth. So in that sense, economics can help, so that again, just by studying race relations alone, without any mention of the economic aspects and the economic dimensions, itself would be deficient. So if we're only trying to understand race by the social and historic and psychological aspects, so economics has to provide some part of the context, but not the entire context. Moving on to the other things that you mentioned, and I think we can talk about climate a bit more in the other questions as well. But climate, again, it's a multi-layered and multifaceted problem that economics alone cannot tackle, because it relates to the physical planet. So you need to understand the climatology, you need to understand the atmospheric science and how carbon enters and disappears from the cycle, and how an increase in carbon concentration would lead to a rise in temperatures and things like that. So this is all science that it's largely independent of economics, because you're now talking at the molecular and in some cases even more fundamental quantum mechanical interactions that are happening there. So you might say, okay, then climate doesn't have anything to do with economics, and we can decouple the two. But both climate scientists and economists understood long ago that that's not the case, because the reason why carbon concentrations are increasing is because of industrial production and other aspects of modern life that have an economic component. Again, just like in race relations, the economics plays a very important role in determining how much of that production and consumption and so on and so forth is going to be dumping not only carbon but other types of secondary wasteful products into the environment. And so that was always somewhat understood, and then more recently, and this is where the discussion on climate change became much more connected to economics, is the other way around, is that the climate itself, by reaching limits of how much it can absorb of all of this industrial waste and carbon increase, when it gets stretched to the limit that it cannot absorb it too much more without changing the physical constraints of the climate itself, and changing by not only increasing the temperature, but then changing all sorts of sea currents and other climate modules and climate components, then that has an impact on the economy, right? So the economy has an impact on the climate by, say, simplistically, by increasing emissions, but then the climate will have an impact on the economy by simply decreasing the amount of capital and the amount of production that you can make by actually, damaging. And this goes into this very controversial topic of damage functions, how to quantify. It's very difficult, but it's undeniable that there is a feedback effect from the climate into the economy. The most obvious one is just damages that are caused by extreme climate events, floods, and so on and so forth. But there's damage in terms of loss of productivity, there's damage in terms of higher depreciation of capital, and all sorts of other ways in which then the climate now can be a substantial drag in the economy. And I'm not talking about the type of marginal changes, because there's the another sort of coming back from the abstract studies in economics, is that another belief is that there's an equilibrium from which you only deviate in small amounts. There's small shocks to the equilibrium, and then the economic system itself will bring it back by responding to those shocks in some optimal way. And typically this is done in, talking mathematically for a moment, this is done in a linear fashion. So that means that you only look at the small effects and then the small responses to those effects. But the issues that like we're talking about, the changes that happen in the climate and this big integrated systems for the planet as a whole, the changes are not small. They might start small, but then you have very large bifurcation, so to speak. That means that the overall effect of these small changes is a completely different path than you started before. And at that point, then the response of the economic system to this large change in the physical system is not going to be small either. So you're going to have damages and destruction and loss of output that are not linearly related to what the shocks were. They're much larger than what the original shocks were. And at that point, then it becomes very important to understand this relationship. So there's nonlinear feedbacks between the climate and economics. But I feel that I've moved, just like talking about bifurcations, I moved too far away from the start of the question. But it's trying to come back. So does economics do a good job in understanding or helping this other discipline? So I think we'll go back to something that I said in the previous questions. It does, to the extent that it provides the sort of the grounding for some of the questions that need to be asked, because these are not disconnected from issues of production and consumption and profits and capital. But it's not all that is, right? So you cannot understand the climate, and in particular, you cannot try to force the theoretical framework that is used for economic systems into other disciplines and into the understanding of other type of phenomena. A typical example that I give in connection to climate is that the so-called dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models that are very much in vogue in macroeconomics, at the core, there's this mechanism for adjusting to deviations from equilibrium, and the adjustments are done by adjusting expectations. And because a rational agent will see that that deviation from equilibrium can move the system to a very undesirable state, and because the undesirable state is worse than the desirable state, no rational person will continue in a path of something that you know it's going to be worse. So you adjust. But the technique was invented for things that have to do with variables that are very much sensitive to those expectations. So the classical example and the example, that's how the technique was invented by people like Sargent, famous economist, is inflation expectations and expectations with respect to interest rates and their relationship to inflation. So if you see a path where you're either going to have persistent deflation or explosive inflation, what you do is to adjust your expectations. So there's an instantaneous adjustment in prices and everything else that depend on future inflation, so that you're restored to the equilibrium path. Okay, but that just doesn't work for a climate mechanism, because you cannot simply adjust emissions by adjusting your expectations. You can adjust prices. Prices are, after all, more or less constructions. People agree to pay or not to pay a given price, but there's no issue to agree with the environment of what the level of emission is going to be. It's there, and once it's there, it takes its time, and the time is dictated by something that is completely outside the realm of the expectation of economic agents. It's really now a physical process, and the physical process is an out of equilibrium, slowly adjusting physical mechanism. So trying to couple a equilibrium instantaneously adjusting framework, which is what happens in dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models, which are also the models that are behind many of the climate economic integrated models, such as DICE and other models. Trying to shoehorn a equilibrium instantaneously adjusting framework into an out of equilibrium slowly adjusting climate framework just doesn't work. It's orthogonal. It's methodologically impossible to reconcile. So that should not be the way that economics is integrated with other disciplines, in particular with climate. So what do? In the battle of what to adjust, you don't adjust the climate science, you adjust the economics. You then try to see what are models that are compatible with this type of out of equilibrium dynamics and with this type of non-clearing, so the conditions are not going to be matched all the time. And if they're not matched, then what type of slowly adjusting dynamics you can have, with the possibility of overshooting, with the possibility of cycles, with the possibility of oscillations that just increase and get out of hand, and so on and so forth. All of the dynamic phenomena that are not there in the equilibrium framework of economics that were designed for markets and relationships, in which maybe expectations play an oversized role. But for example, financial markets, it's clear that expectations play an oversized role in there. It's all that dictates the problem, but perhaps not all, but it's like to first approximation is what dictates the price of financial securities. So maybe that's appropriate for that, but it's not appropriate for interaction with the climate, for example. So this is a little bit loaded, because it could easily sort of degenerate into a sort of witch hunt, right? Something is done there, like, there's the army developed the atomic bomb, and the atomic bomb was only possible because of development in fundamental physics. So let's make Albert Einstein accountable for it. So we need to be careful in the attribution of responsibility, because there's a long chain from Albert Einstein to the launching of the atomic bomb, and a lot of responsibility needs to be taken along that chain. But with economists, sometimes it's somewhat easier to do that, because not only they're not just writing the papers and participating in conferences and giving generic advice. Sometimes economists are directly advising not only policymakers but companies and other important actors and or associations, corporations, sometimes workers associations. So there are economists that advise unions and so on. So in that case, when I think it's direct attribution of some decision and some policy, then the economists should be held accountable in the same way that any person with authority in an organization could be the chief financial officer of a bank. All the decisions were made under the chief financial officer, so the chief financial officer should be held accountable. Banks also have chief economists, and it is the case that they have to answer for the policies and decisions that the banks make. And I have heard from some chief economists of banks precisely that they have given advice, then the advice was neglected. And if that can be documented, that, it's like the medical system acting against medical advice, right? So if some bank or some corporation or some association acted against the advice of their chief economist or of their economic council, then no, right? Then you cannot blame the economists for something that they were saying that they should be doing the opposite. But in many cases, it's not like this. You can actually pinpoint specific decisions, especially in the realm of regulation and other areas of government, where it's easy to identify a kind of revolving door, right? So I'm not going to cite names, but people can easily search for economists that went into government, implemented policies and decisions, most often about regulations that affect part of industry, then come out of government and go to work for that specific industry. So in that case, is evident that the economists should be responsible for the effects of whatever policy or regulation or deregulation happen. And sometimes it happens again. They then go back from industry into the next administration once there is a change in government. And this should not be, ideally should not be allowed to be so explicit, this kind of influence. But if it does exist, and then you have some negative consequences, and it could be in the financial industry, but it could be in some other types of industry, car manufacturing or tobacco or what have you, that where there are measurable consequences of what's happening, and then not only the economists, in the same way that you would hold executives of corporations and public officers, right? So accountable, then the economists that participated on that should be accountable. But like I said at the start, this should not be an intellectual witch hunt, because intellectual disputes are difficult to arbitrate, right? So we still don't have a final answer for questions like should the government spend more to make an economy recover or not. I have a particular belief, and it's a belief grounded on my own research and the research that I have read from others. But my answer is yes, the government should do it. But I know equally passionate and genuine people who think that the answer is no, the government shouldn't be spending because some notion of austerity and return of confidence is the right thing to do. And then some policy is actually implemented, and then there are things that happen. For example, one might say, the cut into hospital budgets led to an increase in amount of death. Well, should the economists that promoted austerity be charged with those deaths? It's very diffuse, right? Because a lot of things happen in between. There are a lot of and this might be a way for just denying responsibility, but I think at that level of uncertainty on the effects of policies and actually not settling what the right directions are or are not, trying to determine it with the level of precision that is required for attribution of guilt in a legal way, right? In a sort of a in the way that in the legal system you have to say that. So what are the conditions? It needs to be beyond reasonable doubt, right? So I think the threshold of beyond reasonable doubt is not reached in those cases. But in the cases that I mentioned before, where it's a direct person that made a concrete advice for a specific change in regulation, and that change in regulation caused some measurable effect, well, then no doubt, and I think the legal system has ways of attributing responsibility to that. So I think does economics explain capitalism? Well, economics should explain all types of economic relations, not only capitalism, right? So in principle, the economic relations that were in place in the Middle Ages and feudalism should be explained by economics. It's like saying history. Does history explain capitalism? Well, history should explain capitalism, but all other types of systems that were in place in different points. It should the opposite should not be the case, right? Does economics only explain capitalism? Is it only applied to capitalism? No, that's certainly not. And capitalism, I don't think, is the ultimate economic system, that it's here to stay and cannot be transcended. But then moving on to the second part of the questions, what is capitalism? So my answer right now, it's influence. I just finished reading Piketty's book on capital, not capital in the 21st century, the follow-up, capital and ideology. And so I have to say I'm heavily influenced by the view of that book, because I just finished reading it. But in there, he makes the argument that capitalism is a special case of something larger called proprietarianism. So proprietarian ideology is the ideology of that any individual can hold property, private property, and this is not something that was always true throughout history. It used to be the case that only certain individuals, and in particular a small number of individuals, so those in both either in the religion helm or in the warrior class, so the noble class, they could have property and nobody else. So the innovation that in principle everyone can have property was an important innovation in moving from feudalism into the new proprietarian age. And with it came also the change in who can dispense justice, right? So it was also the case that only the nobles, the noble class and the church could dispense this what he calls regalian powers, so the powers of regulate and determine justice between individuals, and so the innovation that came out of that, and this was the birth of societies like from the French Revolution, was that these two things got decoupled, and on the one hand, everyone can have property in principle. And on the other hand, the only actor that can dispense justice is the state. So there's a centralized state that deals with this regalian powers, and there's the possibility that everyone has property. And the two things came together and were very important. They were part of this dissociation and the crumbling of this medieval way of organizing society. But the point is that this was pushed to an extreme, that the property became then something that it's kind of sacralized. It's something that cannot be. It's a kind of a divine right as well. So it's extrapolating from the principle that everyone can have property to the principle that property cannot be touched by the state. Right? It's separated from the state, but it also cannot be touched. The state only deals with criminal justice and so on and so forth, but can never touch on property. And this, of course, then it predates capitalism, but it was ideal for the development of capitalism, because so then what is capitalism is the extrapolation of that logic to the situation where you have organized labor, not organized labor in terms of unions and so on. I'm confusing the terms here. But when you have organized production and large-scale production, and then international trade and international finance, and so what is capitalism is the extension of this proprietarian logic, where the right to hold property is something that should be absolute and untouched by the other aspects of society, to the age of large-scale production and financial flows and international trade. Now, is this the only way in which economics can operate? Far from it. So there's an entire spectrum of so the opposite would be when there is no private property, and all of the property is also owned by the state, that not only regulates the regalian powers, but also the economic relations, and that's the extreme tried under communism, for lack of a better word. But are these two extremes the only possibilities? On the one side, sacrosanct rights of holding any amount of property without any possibility of the state intervening, and on the other side, nobody having the right to hold any property. And just from a mathematical point of view, if you like, it's absurd to think that you only have the two extremes on the possible set. You have everything in between, and in particular, a system where it's embedded in the system that, if necessary, there's going to be a redistribution of property. This is the whole point of progressive taxation and other means. So there's no revolutionary concept in here. It's just exploring what the middle ground is in between those extremes. And there's a lot that can be done in that middle ground. For example, like I said, with progressive taxes, but also with different ways of organizing decision power for whoever holds capital. So this also kind of a divine principle that shareholders should have absolute control of what happens in a company, well, is not necessarily the case, right? So we have examples, for example, in Germany and in Nordic countries where there's division of decision power between shareholders and workers in a company. But then, from a point of view of North American or English person say, whoa, what are you saying here? The shareholders don't really own the company they have. Well, yes, they don't have absolute power in deciding on wages and where the company is going to be investing, just because they have the capital. So there's a little bit of a division. Does that mean that you abolish shareholders altogether and everything is a commune? Also not the case, right? So I would say capitalism is one particular possibility, but definitely not the only possibility, and more should be explored. So by setting up that other traditional systems that endure for many centuries and then eventually disappear, by setting the question up this way, it looks like the only possible answer is that capitalism in the way that it's understood today is also going to disappear. And I think that's more or less obvious because circumstances are going to change, and we're not going to have the same type of organization of labor and companies and taxes and so on forever. But I think so. Is it going to change in a way that leads to a better distribution of capital and resources and well, frankly, the proceeds of what the system is generating, or is it going to change to something that it's even more concentrated, even more, inegalitarian, and so in principle, I think theoretically it could also go to this other direction. I mean, just because extreme unequal societies disappeared in the past doesn't mean that they're not going to reappear, right? So the history is also not linear, that once we understood that something didn't work, that same thing cannot come back again. Slavery was once abolished and then returned, and you had slavery in antiquity, and then eventually got abolished in Europe, only to return to European domains in other parts of the world with different justifications. So in the same way, the type of even feudal societies with on the one hand a very highly developed academic learned class. So imagine for a while, for a moment, a situation where you have all these people with highly advanced university degrees trying to maintain their high status in society. Well, that's a bit like the religious classes in the Middle Ages. And on the other side, you have people with very prominent practical skills, for example, in manufacturing and business. So the CEO class, so to speak, well, they become the equivalent of the nobility or the warriors in the Middle Ages. And then in the middle, you have everybody else who don't either have access to education, because education is becoming more and more also, unequal and stratified, and also don't have access to what makes you successful in business, which frankly is starting off with capital to begin with. So you could end up with just our very sort of highly sophisticated, financialized, globalist, capitalist society, devolving back to a sort of feudalism by different names, right? You would still have a learned class that preserves its privileges of advising, and perhaps there are going to be many economists, and the economists are going to be the new, monasteries, and they're going to have the universities there, carefully copying texts from one economist to another, and then you have the very militarized and rich and sort of merchant class holding all of the capital that is there. And so what are the limits for that? There are very few theoretical limits. Capital can continue to be concentrated, and well, I mean, you might say that then there's going to be a revolution and so on. But those things are also difficult, right? The Middle Ages survived for several centuries without large-scale revolutions, precisely because the sort of very concentrated, rich warrior class was also powerful and was able to sort of suppress peasant revolutions all over the place. So it's not guaranteed that system also is not unstable, is not stable, and it's not going to survive for a long time. So we might be, pessimistically speaking, we might be heading for a long period of increase in inequality, and then throw into that the issue of climate change. So that might be the ultimate break to that system, not because of some internal mechanisms of society, but because nature and the planet itself is going to put a stop to it, and maybe with more pandemics and so on. But that's very bleak and pessimistic. Now, what are the alternatives? Well, there are other alternatives, just like I was saying. So you could have a situation where capital doesn't concentrate so extremely in the hands of a few prominent CEOs, but how does that happen? Well, there needs to be a process of very strong deliberation in society where there's a conscious decision that this is something that is not desirable, and then you take measures such as have high progressive taxes in income, and taxes on property, and taxes on inheritance, coupled with very large scale education investment, so that everybody has access, not just the highly skilled, high learned prophets of capitalism. So everybody has access to the benefits of education, but this requires, as I said, it's not it's not going to be the elites that are going to voluntarily say, okay, well, take it away from us. This requires mobilization and deliberation and democratic decisions that this is what needs to be done, and it includes at the core, mobilizing the resources that are available to the general public, and those resources are the state. So in terms of a large-scale investment in, as I mentioned, education, but large-scale investment in preventing climate change, making sure that whoever needs employment finds employment, and it's not only necessary to find employment in the corporate sector that is then dominated by highly concentrated capital that then can dictate what the wages are. Make it a competition. Have in the United States, when they were debating the future of healthcare, there was this thing mentioned, the public option, right? So the public option was the option to have health insurance provided by the government in competition with the private sector, precisely to see which sector can offer that better. Well, make that competition across the board, right? So if the private sector can only offer jobs that are below subsistence level. If the only way for Walmart to exist is to pay below minimum wage wages to their employees, well, then have better jobs in the public sector. Of course, not doing the same thing. Nobody is advocating that the public sector opens up supermarkets to sell cheap goods, but there are several things that the public sector needs to do, for example, in relation to climate change. So there's no shortage of jobs that the public sector could offer in genuine competition, so that there is no race to the bottom in terms of wages and working conditions. So all of those things should be on the table. Progressive taxes, large-scale public investment. What I just described was akin to a job guarantee that has been mentioned in the United States. A basic income, why not? So I'm very eclectic in terms of the alternatives, and I think it needs to be tried and experimented, just in the way that Germany experimented with board participation for workers, and it worked. Nobody will say that German companies are unproductive, right? What was the last time that you said that you saw anybody complaining that German companies were unproductive? Maybe Italian companies, but not German ones, right? And so clearly, there's room for organizing both the private and the public sector in different ways that would avoid the sort of bleak, inegalitarian and highly concentrated and ultimately destructive of the environment scenario that I described before. Yeah, so I think I just answered that, but maybe trying to summarize. That no, definitely it's not the best way to serve the needs of humanity, and a system where there's more participation in sort of the even in not only in the decision making through this type of German style shared boards, but in the actual ownership of capital. And how do you make more people own capital? Is by giving it to them. And how do you give capital to people that don't have capital? It's by taxing high amounts of capital. So this sounds confiscatory, and people in the right-wing circles would say socialism. Well, it has elements of socialism, but it's not the doesn't need to be the end point where nobody owns property, and property is entirely owned by the state. What I'm describing, and again, I'm highly influenced by the book I just read by Piketty, but it matches with my previous sort of understanding of what was going on, is that there's room for ownership, for private ownership, but highly concentrated private ownership is not the most efficient way of organizing things. So when and progressive taxation is not an abstract, crazy idea. It existed. It existed for a very long time in the United States. It existed in a very long time in the UK. And both countries had extremely high growth rates during the time when they had very high taxes. So there's nothing absolutely crazy about that. Now, unfortunately, the Soviet experience with communism was a disaster, and that, in a sense, has tainted the entire discussion about possibilities of shared ownership and redistribution of capital. But it shouldn't. right? We should be talking about these things in a pragmatic way. And just to conclude, that the idea that something is a slippery slope, and if you start talking about redistribution, you end up with communism, is the weakest possible intellectual argument. The idea that once you open the Pandora box, there's no way to know what's coming out of there. It's lazy. It's absolutely lazy, right? It presupposes that people are not capable of finding an intermediate point between two extremes. And in daily life, we do that, right? We don't only spend all that we earn or save all that we earn. We find an intermediate point between our spending and our saving that satisfies our needs. So if we are able to do this kind of, it doesn't need to be a very sophisticated optimization. We do that in daily life. We find intermediate points in daily life. We can find an intermediate point for society as well.